She approaches without a smile. Her steps sharp, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. A waitress stops in front of a black man sitting alone at a table. She doesn't ask for his order, she doesn't offer water, she doesn't even say hello. Instead, with a cold tone, she says, "We won't be serving you today." Jordan Miles lifts his eyebrows slightly, surprised, but not shaken. He doesn't argue. He simply looks at her in silence. And just like that, in under 30 seconds, a question starts forming in the minds of everyone watching: why? Why is he being refused service? Why is she so sure she has the right, and who exactly is this man? The story begins. Just moments earlier, everything had felt still. Ordinary. The kind of quiet confidence that follows a long day and the simple desire to sit down, enjoy a warm meal, and maybe breathe for a while. Jordan Miles stepped into the restaurant without fanfare. He wasn't wearing a suit, but he looked put together. His clothes were pressed, shoes polished, and his shoulders held a quiet dignity that didn't need to be spoken. He didn't come to impress. He came to eat. The restaurant was the kind you'd find in glossy magazines: white tablecloths, gentle lighting, walls lined with vintage wine bottles. A place where servers glided between tables and conversations stayed just above a whisper. Jordan approached the front desk with a small nod and said, "Just one tonight, please." His voice was even, polite, almost cheerful. He meant no trouble. He never did. The hostess looked up from her screen. For a second, her face gave nothing away. Then her brows twitched, barely noticeable, but there. Her gaze dropped to his shoes, then to his jacket, then back to his face. She didn't smile. Instead, she paused, as if calculating something. Then she gave a curt nod, grabbed a menu, and turned without a word. Jordan followed. As they walked through the dining area, heads turned. Not all, but enough. A couple by the fireplace stopped mid-conversation. A man near the bar leaned back in his seat. Some stares lingered, others flicked away like nothing had happened. But Jordan felt them. He always did. The hostess led him to a table in the back, near the kitchen doors, just out of sight from the main dining floor. She placed the menu down quickly and walked away before he could even thank her. No greeting, no offer of water, no "your server will be right with you." Just silence. Jordan sat down slowly, adjusting his chair so it didn't wobble. He scanned the menu briefly, then folded it, resting his hands on the table. He didn't take out his phone. He didn't look around, even though he could still feel the weight of glances. He just sat. Quiet, composed, waiting. He had no idea what was coming. No way of knowing that this evening, meant to be simple, was about to turn into something cruel. The kind of moment that leaves a mark, not just because of what was done, but because of how many people stood by and watched. At first, Jordan thought the waitress might return with water, maybe a simple greeting. But when she approached, there was no tray in hand, no warmth in her eyes. She stopped a few feet from the table and crossed her arms loosely. "Just so you know," she said, "we're fully booked for the evening." Her tone was blunt, unapologetic. She didn't bother to glance at the half-empty dining room. She didn't need to pretend. Her eyes were fixed on him, not the facts. Jordan looked around, slowly, carefully. Tables stood ready, untouched, white linen smooth, silverware aligned. Not one of them had a reserved sign. Not one of them was occupied. He turned back to her, trying to keep his voice even. "It looks like you've got room," he said. It wasn't a challenge. Just an observation. The waitress didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand and tilted her head. "Manager," she called over her shoulder, "we've got an issue here." An issue. Jordan felt the word more than he heard it. It wasn't the volume. It was the implication. He wasn't a customer anymore. He was a problem. The manager arrived with practiced steps, a clipboard in one hand and a rehearsed smile stretching his face. "Good evening," he said, as if this were just another customer complaint. "Is there a problem?" His voice dripped with fake concern, the kind that hopes to sound helpful while already moving toward a decision. Before Jordan could answer, the waitress leaned in and said, "He doesn't seem to have a reservation." Her words were sharp, fast, clean. The manager nodded, pretending to process new information. "Well," the manager began, crouching a little like he was trying to appear gentle, "we do have policies about reservations, and unfortunately, we're operating at capacity tonight. I'm afraid we won't be able to serve you." Jordan kept his eyes on him, steady. "That's strange," he said. "No one mentioned that when I was seated. And the tables," he gestured lightly around him, not angry, just clear. "They don't look full." Behind the manager, a table of four had started whispering. One of the men let out a soft laugh, leaned in toward his friend, and said something Jordan couldn't quite hear. But the tone was familiar. Ugly. A quiet kind of mockery meant only for certain people. The manager straightened. He cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's a more casual place down the street. I think you'd find it more suitable." Jordan didn't flinch. He folded his hands on the table and spoke without raising his voice. "I'm not looking for casual," he said. "I came here because I wanted a meal. Nothing more." The manager didn't respond right away. He glanced at the waitress, then back at Jordan. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was intentional. A kind of pressure, hoping he would give up and walk out on his own. But Jordan didn't move. He didn't apologize for being there. He didn't explain his presence, his clothes, or his choice of restaurant. He simply stayed, calmly asking for the same thing every other customer had already been given. A seat. A menu. And basic human respect. By now, the energy in the restaurant had shifted. What began as subtle exclusion had turned into something more public, more intentional. It was no longer about keeping things quiet. It was about sending a message. The waitress returned to Jordan's table with a different tone. This time, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to sound casual, but loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You know," she said, her smile thin and condescending, "some of these dishes cost more than a week's pay. Are you sure this is really the kind of place you're looking for?" Her words dangled in the air like bait, hoping to sting, to shame, to push him to say something, anything, that might justify her treatment. Jordan looked up at her. He didn't blink. He didn't frown. He just said, calmly, "I'd still like to see the menu." The waitress didn't move right away. She stared for a second longer than she needed to. Then she let out a quiet chuckle, the kind that tells you you're being laughed at, not with. She walked away. At a nearby table, a man in a tailored suit dropped his napkin. It slid off his lap and landed closer to Jordan's side than his own. He leaned back in his chair, stretched out an arm, and pointed toward it. "Hey man," he said, with a smirk, "mind grabbing that for me?" His tone was coated in mock friendliness, but the mockery was louder than the words. No one at his table laughed, but no one stopped him either. Jordan didn't react. He didn't lean over. He didn't acknowledge the request. He sat still, eyes forward, spine straight. The napkin stayed on the floor. When the waitress returned, she dropped the menu on his table with a flick of the wrist. It landed with a dull thud, pages flipping open. She didn't speak. She didn't look at him. She simply turned and walked away, chuckling softly to herself as if she had just scored a private victory. Moments later, another employee walked past, one of the younger busboys, no older than 20. As he passed behind Jordan, he slowed slightly, looked over his shoulder, and made an obscene gesture with his hand. Quick, sharp, and smug. A cheap act of rebellion meant only for his co-workers to see. He thought he was being clever. He thought Jordan wouldn't notice. But Jordan noticed. He saw every movement, every whisper, every glance that lingered too long. And still, he didn't flinch. He didn't look down. He didn't speak. He didn't leave. He sat there, back straight, hands folded, and eyes calm. He was a still figure in the middle of something ugly, and somehow, that quiet presence, unshaken, unmoved, felt louder than anything happening around him. In a room filled with noise, Jordan's silence became a mirror. One that forced everyone watching to see not who he was, but who they were becoming. Time passed, but not much had changed. The table in front of Jordan remained empty, no food, no water, no acknowledgement of his presence beyond the hostility he hadn't asked for. And yet, he didn't move. He sat patiently, as if hoping the ugliness around him would pass like a bad storm. Then came the next act. The waitress approached once more, holding a single glass of water in her hand. There was no tray. No coaster. No napkin. She leaned over carelessly, reached across the table, and just as the glass was placed down, it tipped. The water didn't just spill, it poured. It ran across the tablecloth, soaked the menu, splashed onto Jordan's shirt, and slid down to his lap. Ice clung to fabric. He flinched only slightly, more from the shock of cold than anything else. The room went still, but only for a beat. The silence wasn't concern, it was calculation. People waited to see how he would respond. The waitress looked at the mess she'd made, then at Jordan. She didn't gasp. Didn't apologize. Instead, she stepped back, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "You know, maybe you should try somewhere more suitable." Her tone wasn't rushed, wasn't embarrassed. It was final. As if she were doing him a favor by pointing out he didn't belong. Jordan reached for the edge of a napkin, slowly blotting the front of his shirt. His movements were careful, deliberate. He didn't speak. Not yet. He didn't trust his voice to stay calm, and he refused to let it break. From the other side of the room, a man who had been watching stood up. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with a voice that cut across the tables like a dull blade. He pulled a few folded bills from his wallet, walked toward Jordan, and placed the money gently on the edge of the table. "Here," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Dinner's on me. Or maybe, take it somewhere that fits your kind." There was a pause. Jordan looked at the cash, then at the man. His jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. He picked up the money, extended it back, and laid it firmly on the man's palm. "I didn't come here for handouts," he said, softly. "I came here to have dinner. That's all." The man stared at him for a second, then scoffed and walked off, stuffing the bills back into his wallet like he'd been robbed of something. Around them, glasses clinked faintly. Forks scraped plates. No one said a word. The waitress didn't return with a towel. She didn't clean the table. She didn't check if he needed anything. She simply disappeared again, leaving him wet, alone, and surrounded by a silence that felt louder with each passing second. And yet, Jordan didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He sat in the middle of that space, soaked in water but rooted in dignity. His presence was no longer quiet, it was defiant. Every person in that room could feel it. The injustice was no longer hidden beneath layers of politeness. It was exposed, raw, and undeniable. And still, no one stood up. No one spoke up. The weight of complicity pressed down on every empty word and every averted eye. The tension didn't rise like drama. It settled like truth. There's a point when silence becomes unbearable. Not for the one who's been wronged, but for those doing the wrong. Jordan's calm had become a threat. His refusal to break, to shout, to walk out, it unsettled them. They needed control, and they were losing it. The manager returned with a different kind of energy. His footsteps were faster, more forceful. He didn't smile this time. He didn't bother pretending to care. His voice was louder, sharp enough to draw attention from the nearby tables. "Sir," he said, "I've asked you to leave once. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to call security." He didn't phrase it like a warning. He phrased it like a decision already made. There was no reason given. No reference to any rule, any policy, any offense. Just the threat of removal. Just the reminder that in this place, power didn't need justification. It only needed volume. Jordan looked up, calm as ever. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He simply said, "Then I'd like to speak with the owner." The moment the words left his mouth, the atmosphere shifted, but not in the way truth usually does. There was no hush of recognition, no pause of reconsideration. There was laughter. It started small, just a few snickers from a table near the bar, but it grew quickly. Within seconds, more guests were joining in. A woman chuckled behind her wine glass. A man leaned back, elbow on his chair, head tilted, enjoying the spectacle. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't about joy. It was about dominance. It said, "You actually think you matter here." One man couldn't resist. He turned in his seat, locked eyes with Jordan, and said with a mocking grin, "Who do you think you are?" The words weren't just for Jordan. They were for the room. An invitation to keep laughing. To keep belittling. To remind everyone that this wasn't a conversation. It was a show. But Jordan didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't shrink. He didn't snap. Instead, he smiled. Gently. The kind of smile that doesn't need to explain itself. The kind that comes from knowing something the rest of the room hasn't caught up to yet. He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but steady. "That," he said, "is something you'll find out very soon." The laughter didn't stop immediately. But it faltered. The room didn't go silent. But it leaned in. There was something in the way he said it. Something in his composure. In his patience. In his absolute refusal to be rattled. For the first time, the mockery began to feel uncertain. The joke no longer landed. They thought they were watching a man out of place. But slowly, without realizing it, they were becoming part of a story that wasn't theirs to control. Something was about to change. And deep down, a few of them were starting to sense it. The humiliation had run its course. Every eye in the restaurant had lingered too long, every smirk had cut a little deeper, every word, every glance had done its damage. But Jordan hadn't moved. Hadn't snapped. Hadn't defended himself in the way they expected, or wanted. He had simply endured. And now, it was time to end the performance. He reached into his jacket pocket with slow, measured intent and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it with a swipe, tapped a contact, and brought it to his ear. His voice, when he spoke, was low and steady. "It's time. Make the call," he said. Then he ended the call and calmly placed the phone face down on the table in front of him. The restaurant didn't notice immediately. Conversations continued. Forks clinked. But the manager, who had been lingering nearby with a sense of authority swelling in his chest, suddenly stopped moving when his own phone began to ring. The sound was loud, clear, sharp. It broke through the air with unexpected weight. He checked the caller ID, And everything changed. His face tightened. His lips parted slightly, as if preparing to say something but forgetting what. He answered the call, turned away instinctively, and lowered his voice. Yes, yes, sir. I wasn't aware yes, I understand. Of course. Right away. The silence on the other end was longer than his own words. And when the call ended, he turned back toward Jordan, not with the swagger of authority, but with the caution of someone who just realized they were standing on the wrong side of something much bigger than themselves. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Jordan stood up, slow and composed, and reached into his wallet. From it, he pulled a business card. He didn't flash it. Didn't wave it around. He extended it toward the manager with a single hand, steady and firm. The manager took it with both hands, like it was fragile. His eyes scanned the print. The logo of the parent restaurant group was unmistakable, sleek, embossed, the kind of design reserved for executives. Underneath, in bold letters, a name, Jordan Miles, founder and chief executive officer. There was a pause. Jordan met his eyes. No anger. No vengeance. Just clarity. My name is Jordan Miles, he said. I own this restaurant chain. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed heavily in the quiet that followed. People who had laughed stopped breathing. People who had judged sat frozen. The waitress, who had just stepped out from the kitchen, saw the manager's expression and went pale. The guests who had once felt bold now looked small. And Jordan didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat, didn't smile with victory. He simply stood where he always had, but now the room saw him for who he really was. He wasn't just a man who came to eat. He was the reason the doors were open, the reason the lights were on, the reason they all had jobs and tables and comfort. And now, for the first time, no one knew where to look. The weight of the reveal didn't just settle, it crashed. What had started as a tense dinner service now felt like something else entirely. Like a reckoning. Like a mirror being held up to every face in the room. For a long moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then, slowly, reality began to sink in. Across the dining room, guests who had laughed minutes earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away, their eyes fixed on anything but Jordan. Others bowed their heads, the heat of shame rising to their faces. A couple quietly folded their napkins, stood, and left without finishing their meals. No one dared to speak. No one knew what to say. One woman near the window whispered something to her husband. He didn't respond. He simply reached for the check, signaled for the waiter, and kept his eyes on the floor. The man who had mocked Jordan so confidently earlier now sat frozen, staring at the glass in his hand as if it could undo what had been said. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He didn't apologize. He didn't laugh. He didn't move. At the side of the room, the waitress stood like a statue. Her confidence had vanished. Her smirk, gone. Her breath came fast, uneven. She looked to the manager, then to the kitchen, then back at Jordan, searching for some kind of escape. But there was none. She had nowhere to go that wouldn't follow her. Her face paled as she realized the man she had tried to ignore now held the power to decide her future. The manager was already unraveling. He fumbled with the business card still in his hand, his voice cracking as he tried to form a coherent sentence. "Mr. Miles, please. I truly didn't know. I'm so sorry. This is all a misunderstanding. We never intended to offend you." But the words fell apart before they reached their meaning. He wasn't apologizing to a guest anymore. He was apologizing to the owner. To the man who could end his career with a single phone call. And yet, Jordan said nothing. He didn't nod. Didn't wave the apologies away. He just stood still, his presence commanding, his silence more powerful than any rebuke. He didn't need to humiliate anyone. They had done that themselves. Then, finally, he spoke. Calm, steady, with the same composure he'd held all evening. "Bring the staff," he said. "All of them. Right now." It wasn't a request. It wasn't shouted. But it held more weight than anything that had been said all night. The manager blinked, startled by the simplicity of the command, and quickly nodded. He turned and rushed off toward the kitchen. A few moments later, the back doors swung open, and the staff began to appear. Line cooks still in aprons. Hosts and busiers with wide eyes. Servers wiping their hands on napkins, unsure of what they were walking into. They gathered quietly, forming a loose line near the center of the dining room. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Because now they all knew. Jordan wasn't just someone who had been wronged. He was the man who had built the very ground they were standing on. And every person in the room understood that the roles had changed, irreversibly. They stood before him, the entire staff, lined up like students waiting for correction. The room had fallen into a hush, not just out of curiosity, but from a shared understanding that something important was about to be said. There was no music playing now, no clinking of silverware, no forced small talk. The atmosphere was thick with consequence. Jordan looked at them, not with hatred, not with rage, but with something heavier, truth. He had waited, endured, been dismissed, mocked, disrespected. And yet, he stood with dignity still intact. But dignity doesn't mean silence. And this time, he spoke. "This isn't just a mistake," he began. His voice was calm, but it filled the space. "This is what happens when people carry quiet bias and think it's not visible. This is what happens when someone is judged before they've even spoken. When you assume who someone is based on nothing but how they look." A few of the younger employees glanced up, startled by the clarity in his words. "This isn't about bad service," he continued. "It's about something deeper. Something baked in. It's what happens when discrimination is so normal, it hides in smiles and company policy." He took a step forward. No raised voice, no anger. Just truth. "This isn't just a mistake, it's systemic bias." He let that word sit there. Bias. Not shouted. Not blamed. Just named. Then he asked the question no one had the courage to answer. "Would any of this have happened if I didn't look like this?" His eyes moved from face to face. Not searching for guilt, but demanding honesty. No one replied. They didn't need to. The silence was the answer. The manager opened his mouth, his lips trembling slightly, but Jordan held up a hand. "You had multiple chances to stop this," he said. "You chose not to." His tone didn't shake. It didn't rise. It simply stood firm. "Your employment is suspended. Effective immediately. You are no longer to represent this company until further notice." The manager's shoulders fell. His arms hung useless at his sides. There was no protest. No defense. He nodded slowly, turned, and stepped back without another word. Then Jordan turned to the waitress. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. She looked like she wanted to say something, to excuse, to explain, to backpedal. But Jordan's voice cut through before she could. "You will leave this restaurant now," he said. "There is nothing else to discuss." She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked away, her steps echoing across the tile. The same feet that had walked away from him hours earlier now carried the weight of every word unsaid. The staff remained. Quiet. Still. Unsure of what would come next. Among them, a few of the youngest began to shift. One girl, barely out of high school by the look of her, stepped forward slightly. Her voice was soft. "I'm sorry," she said. "I saw it happening. I should have said something." Another followed. "Me too. I knew it wasn't right." Jordan looked at them, not with pity, but with recognition. He didn't smile. But he nodded once. That nod meant everything. Accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about recognition. About standing in the discomfort of truth long enough to learn from it. And in that moment, with heads bowed and words finally spoken, something began to shift, not just in the staff, but in the soul of the place itself. The tension had broken, but what remained wasn't relief, it was reflection. The staff returned to their duties with a new kind of silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but of awareness. Something irreversible had happened. And now, they moved not with routine, but with purpose. Jordan returned to his seat, the same one where he had first been ignored, questioned, humiliated. But now, the energy around him had shifted completely. The same table was no longer a target of ridicule, it was the center of truth. A new server approached with practiced professionalism, placing a fresh napkin beside him, gently removing the damp one that had been left earlier. Another followed, pouring water into a clean glass without a word, but with evident care. Moments later, a plate arrived. The same meal Jordan had originally come for. It was plated with precision, warm, fragrant, served with quiet respect. No one rushed. No one looked away. He picked up his fork, paused, and took his first bite. Not out of hunger, but out of closure. He chewed slowly, his posture calm. For the first time that evening, no one interrupted him. He was given the space he had always deserved. Across the dining room, eyes watched him. The same ones that had once mocked, once doubted, now held something else. They weren't just observing, they were learning. Shame sat with many of them, unspoken but unmistakable. One staff member stepped forward. Young, nervous, but resolute. He had watched everything. Not participated, not laughed, but not spoken up either. And now, he wanted to change that. "Mr. Miles," he said, voice soft but sincere, "would you consider teaching us?" "Teaching me? I want to understand how to be better. I don't want to stay quiet the next time something like this happens." Jordan looked at him for a moment. His gaze wasn't cold. It was honest. Thoughtful. He nodded once, slowly. "I'll help," he said. "I'll provide the training. I'll give you the tools." Then his voice dropped slightly, and the words that followed carried deeper weight. "But I can't teach you how to be decent. That's on you." There was no sting in his tone. No bitterness. Just truth. A line drawn clearly between what could be taught and what had to be chosen. The young man nodded. So did a few others nearby. Meanwhile, the guests who had once filled the room with low laughter now sat still. Some glanced down at their plates. Others looked at Jordan with quiet admiration. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Because what they had witnessed wasn't just a correction. It was a standard. It was the living example of how grace under pressure can be more powerful than rage, and how a single person's restraint can expose everyone else's failure. The restaurant no longer buzzed with arrogance. It hummed with reflection. And in that soft quiet, no one could avoid the question pressing into their conscience. Did I contribute to this, or allow it? And more importantly, who will I choose to be next time? Jordan didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His presence had said enough. Sometimes, the simplest moments uncover the most uncomfortable truths. A black man walks into a restaurant. He sits. He waits. He is ignored. Mocked. Humiliated. And yet, he doesn't shout. He doesn't retaliate. He stays composed, choosing silence over anger, patience over pride. In that silence, something deeper is revealed, not just about him, but about everyone around him. It forces a question we all must face: how do we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us? Jordan's story isn't just about a man reclaiming his power. It's about how character reveals itself under pressure. He showed us that respect is not something earned through wealth, clothing, or perceived status. It is a right we owe to one another, without condition. His quiet strength held a mirror to a room full of people who had judged him without ever knowing him. He reminded us that dignity doesn't come from titles, but from how we carry ourselves in the face of disrespect. And that real change begins when we stop asking who deserves respect, and start offering it to everyone. If this story made you pause, if it challenged the way you see others, or reminded you of something worth standing for, share it. Let someone else hear Jordan's voice. Leave a comment below: what would you have done in that restaurant? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak truth, inspire action, and call for a better world. Because respect begins with how we choose to see one another, and that choice starts with you.